The cup is thrust into your hand before you can refuse. Steam curls upward, bitter and sharp, carrying the smell of scorched grass and iron. The liquid inside is black-green, murky, alive with the taste of earth and ash. You raise it to your lips because everyone else does. The tavern is watching. The first swallow burns like fire, then coils cold in your gut. The taste is worse than bile, worse than rot, worse than hunger itself. Wormwood. It sears your tongue until it feels both numb and aflame, tricking your body into confusion. Someone at the table slams their mug down with a grunt. Another wipes tears from her eyes. No one admits how much it hurts. The bitterness is a test, and to fail it is to be mocked. Around you the room presses close. Rough hands clutching mugs, cracked nails scratching at splintered wood. Laughter too loud to be merry. The air stinks of sweat, unwashed wool, and the smoke of a fire that spits more soot than warmth. Shadows leap across the walls, warped by torchlight, while outside rain lashes the shutters. The brew is no comfort. It is survival. You tilt your cup again. The second sip is worse than the first. It claws at your throat until you cough hard enough to draw stares. A man with a scar down his cheek grins, his teeth yellow, daring you to quit. You grip the mug tighter, forcing the poison down, because weakness here is more dangerous than the drink itself. In the corner, a friar murmurs over his own cup, lips moving as though in prayer. Across the table, a soldier, in ragged boots, drinks without blinking, eyes glazed and distant. They do not drink for pleasure. They drink because the world demands it. The herb promises healing, but its cure tastes like punishment. Your vision swims for a moment. The torches blur, the room tilts, and in the murk of the brew you see something impossible. A faint shimmer, green and spectral, ripples beneath the surface. You blink and it vanishes, leaving only the stench of bitterness and the pounding of your heart. You set the cup down, breath shallow, palms sweating. For an instant, you wonder if what you saw was real. Then someone calls for another round, and the mugs are filled again with the same black brew. You lift it, because you must. You drink, because you cannot stop. And in that bitter mouthful, the centuries ahead already stir. Long before the smoky taverns of medieval Europe, Wormwood had already carved a place in the world's most ancient rituals. In Egypt, its bitter leaves were steeped into infusions meant to purify the body and ward off unseen forces. Physicians in linen robes prescribed it as a cure for stomach worms, while priests burned it in offerings to the gods. Its acrid smoke, twisting upward like a warning. Wormwood was not taken lightly. To touch it was to taste both remedy and ruin. The Greeks gave the plant a name that survives to this day, Artemisia absinthium, linking it to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of women. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, recommended it for menstrual pain, jaundice, and fevers, his recipes echoing with authority. Yet even as doctors praised its virtues, poets hinted at its dangers. To the Greeks, wormwood was a paradox, a gift from the gods that could also drive mortals into madness. The Romans carried that paradox further. Soldiers and gladiators drank vinum absinthiatum, wine steeped with wormwood, as both a tonic and a trial. After brutal games in the Colosseum, the victor was sometimes rewarded with a cup of wormwood wine. It was a cruel honour. The drink was so bitter it twisted the mouth and burned the throat, a reminder that triumph and suffering walked hand in hand. Even in victory, the conqueror tasted defeat. Pliny the Elder wrote of wormwood with reverence, calling it powerful enough to sharpen the appetite and calm seasickness. Mariners carried it across the Mediterranean, convinced it could steady the stomach against rough waters. Yet every use came with risk. Too much of the herb could sicken the body, causing dizziness, tremors, or visions. Those who overindulged were said to see shadows where none existed, green spectres flickering at the edges of their sight. The symbolism grew darker still in Christian texts. The Book of Revelation speaks of a star called Wormwood, falling from the heavens, turning rivers bitter, and killing those who drank them. To the faithful, the plant became an omen of catastrophe, its taste linked forever with judgment and ruin. What was once a medicine became a metaphor for punishment. From temples to battlefields, wormwood was never a simple herb. It was medicine for the desperate, a weapon of the gods, a challenge for the proud. In every sip, the ancients sensed both cure and curse, as though the plant itself carried a secret too heavy to trust. The bitterness lingered, not just on the tongue, but in the mind, refusing to be forgotten. By the time wormwood reached medieval Europe, it already carried centuries of myth and fear. To drink it was to join a lineage of believers, skeptics, healers, and victims, each convinced they could master the bitterness. Few ever did. In the dim cloisters of medieval monasteries, where silence was as strict as prayer, wormwood grew in orderly rows. The monks, keepers of both souls and bodies, cultivated it alongside sage, fennel, and rue. Their gardens were green apothecaries, each plant carrying the weight of centuries of knowledge passed down from Greek physicians and Roman herbalists. To walk through those stone-walled gardens in the 12th and 13th centuries was to inhale a bitter perfume, sharp and cleansing, as if the air itself was steeped in medicine. The herb had many uses, though none were pleasant. Wormwood was steeped into dark wines and thin ales, its acrid taste masked with honey when supplies allowed. It was prescribed for fevers, parasites, and the unsettling pains of the stomach that came with poor bread and unclean water. Patients drank because the monks told them to, believing that obedience and bitterness together could heal the body. Those who resisted often found the cup pressed into their hands anyway, for to refuse a cure was to question God's order. The bitterness itself became part of the ritual. In some monasteries, wormwood was given during fasts, its acrid taste a reminder of suffering and humility. To drink it was to take part in penance, to share in Christ's endurance. The act was physical devotion, the herb's sting, a sermon written on the tongue. Bitter medicine was holy medicine, and wormwood, with its cruel edge, was thought to scourge both body and soul of corruption. Not all believed in its sanctity. In villages beyond the monastery walls, wormwood was used more pragmatically. Housewives boiled it into teas to drive worms from their children's bellies, while shepherds steeped it to treat sick sheep. These folk remedies worked sometimes, and sometimes they harmed. Too much wormwood made a man stagger, his speech slurred, his vision troubled with strange colours. Rumours spread of villagers who drank too deeply and began muttering of spirits at their windows. Yet the monks wrote these tales down carefully, calling them signs of imbalance rather than miracles. Even in learned circles, wormwood remained double-edged. Physicians of the 14th century copied recipes into heavy manuscripts, detailing dosages in cautious strokes of ink. The same pages that praised its power warned against excess, reminding readers that poison often walked beside medicine. To read those texts is to sense the unease beneath the faith, as though the monks themselves feared what they brewed. Still, the plant endured. With every century, wormwood became more familiar, more indispensable. It was both punishment and salvation, an herb that could not be ignored. In the cloisters where chants echoed against stone, monks continued to pour it into cups, certain that its bitterness carried the promise of healing. Whether that promise was real or imagined, no one could say. Long before hops became the universal companion of beer, European brewers relied on what they called gruit, a mix of herbs that flavoured and preserved their ale. Among the tangled sprigs of yarrow, heather, and bog myrtle, wormwood often found its way into the brew. Its bitterness was unmatched, cutting through the sweet heaviness of malt with a sharp edge that lingered on the tongue. To sip a mug of gruit ale in the taverns of the 13th and 14th centuries was to taste the landscape itself, bitter, wild, and unpredictable. The gruit trade was powerful. Monasteries, city councils, and feudal lords all claimed the right to control it, selling licenses and taxing brewers who wished to use the sacred mix. Wormwood, with its fierce tang, was both an ingredient and a weapon of monopoly. To drink ale brewed with it was to participate in an economy of power, whether you knew it or not. Each swallow carried not only bitterness, but the weight of politics, faith, and profit. In the smoky halls of rural taverns, the effects of gruit ales could be startling. Some were mild, enough to dull the aches of farm work. Others were potent, strong enough to blur the senses and stir wild behaviour. Wormwood's presence in these brews was whispered to bring strange dreams and darker moods. Villagers claimed that men who drank too much staggered home seeing shapes in the fields, their eyes haunted by shadows that vanished with daylight. Women muttered that the drink loosened tongues and tempers, filling nights with both laughter and violence. Not everyone trusted the herb. Its reputation had already spread beyond medicine into superstition. Wormwood was burned in doorways to ward off witches and stuffed into charms to protect newborns from spirits. To see it floating in ale was to wonder if one drank protection or curse. Some said it purified, others swore it poisoned, but still the mugs were drained. For many peasants, the bitterness became familiar, even necessary. It was the taste of community, ritual, and escape. The transition from gruit to hops came slowly, a shift that began in the late medieval centuries. Hops preserved beer better, gave it a cleaner flavour, and spread rapidly across northern Europe. Wormwood was pushed aside, lingering only in pockets of tradition, remembered more as a relic than a staple. Yet, in those pockets, it remained potent. To the people who brewed and drank it, wormwood ale carried more than intoxication. It carried memory, the echo of a time when bitterness ruled the cup, and every drink felt close to sorcery. The gruit tradition left its mark. It revealed how deeply wormwood had seeped into daily life, not only as medicine but as common drink. Even as hops took over, the ghost of wormwood lingered in the stories of taverns and the suspicions of neighbours. The bitterness of the herb had already taught Europe a lesson it would never forget. What promises healing can just as easily summon ruin. Beyond monastery walls and city taverns, wormwood lived quietly in the hands of peasants and folk healers. Its grey-green stalks, bitter leaves, and yellow blossoms grew along the edges of fields and paths, needing little care, surviving where finer plants withered. To villagers in the 1400s and 1500s, it was as common as it was dangerous. Women cut sprigs in the early morning dew, hanging them in kitchens or drying them above hearths, knowing that its bitterness was both cure and curse. The herb found its way into countless remedies. Mothers steeped it into teas to rid their children of worms that gnawed at their bellies. Farmers boiled it into concoctions to dose sick animals, especially sheep and goats, hoping to save their livelihoods from ruin. A few drops of wormwood tincture, dissolved in rough ale, were said to sharpen the appetite of men too weary to eat after long days in the fields. In every cottage, wormwood was there, waiting in jars and bundles, a bitter constant in the fragile rhythm of survival. Yet the line between healing and harm was perilously thin. A strong brew could soothe pain or calm fever, but a brew too strong made men stumble and women shake. Neighbours whispered of those who took too much and began seeing flickers of green at the edges of their vision, shadows that shifted like spirits in the corner of a room. Some claimed wormwood opened a door to the unseen world, allowing the dead to whisper through. Others swore it was simply the mind unravelling under poison. Either way, stories spread quickly in the tight circles of village life, and Wormwood's reputation deepened. Folk healers knew its dangers well. Many were midwives, women who balanced knowledge of herbs with whispers of sorcery. They would measure out wormwood carefully, muttering charms as they poured it, as though words themselves might temper the bitterness. For their skill, they were both sought after and feared. A woman who cured one child might be accused of cursing another. Wormwood, in her hands, became an emblem of that fragile balance between healing and suspicion. Even in times of famine, wormwood remained in use. Its bitterness dulled hunger pangs, tricking the body into forgetting its emptiness, if only for an hour. Families clung to it when bread was scarce, a cruel relief that often left them weaker in the end. For the poor, wormwood was both salvation and slow undoing, a plant that mocked them with the illusion of strength. By the late medieval centuries, wormwood had become woven into the folklore of Europe. Sprigs were tied above doors to keep away evil, tucked into pockets to ward off illness, or scattered in graveyards to protect the dead. Its bitter shadow reached into every part of life, from cradle to coffin. Yet beneath the rituals and remedies lingered a truth that no one could quite name. Wormwood was never simply a herb. It was a test, and more often than not, the ones who relied on it found themselves changed in ways they could not explain. As Europe moved into the Renaissance, wormwood began to climb the social ladder. What peasants brewed in rough pots over open fires was reshaped into refined cordials in the gilded halls of nobility. In the kitchens of castles and courts, alchemists and physicians experimented with the bitter herb, mixing it into wines flavoured with honey, cinnamon, or clove. The aim was not only to disguise its bite, but to turn medicine into luxury. Wormwood became part of the spectacle of courtly life, transformed from rustic remedy into a glittering curiosity. At banquets, lords and ladies raised jewelled goblets filled with wormwood-infused wine, their faces contorting at the first sip before smoothing into masks of sophistication. To endure the bitterness without grimace was a performance of refinement, a display of self-control. In a culture where appearance was everything, in courtly circles, even suffering could be fashionable. Recipes for wormwood cordials appeared in the handwritten cookbooks of noble households, alongside confections of sugar and rosewater. To drink bitterness was to show one had wealth enough to chase it with sweetness. Meanwhile, peasants still brewed their own crude versions. Their wormwood teas and ales remained harsh and unadorned, boiled in blackened kettles and poured into chipped wooden mugs. Honey was scarce, spices scarcer still, and for most villagers the bitterness had to be endured without disguise. For them, wormwood was not a fashionable flourish, but a necessity, a rough answer to sickness, hunger, and fatigue. The same plant that glittered in golden cups at court smouldered in soot-stained pots in the countryside. This divide between classes echoed in medicine. Court physicians, influenced by ancient texts, praised wormwood as a purifier of the humours, useful for balancing bile and blood. They prescribed it carefully, measured in drops and diluted in wines. Folk healers, without access to books or costly wines, relied on instinct and tradition. Their doses were rough, sometimes effective, sometimes disastrous. Both groups wielded the same plant, but the line between healing and harm was thinner for the poor. There was also a symbolic weight to wormwood that lingered across both worlds. In noble courts, it represented discipline and refinement, proof that even bitterness could be tamed by wealth and power. In villages, it represented endurance, the ability to stomach what life forced upon you. Whether served in crystal goblets or wooden cups, wormwood reminded drinkers that survival often meant swallowing what was harsh. unwelcomed, and unrelenting. By the 16th century, wormwood had become a plant of paradox. It united the highest and the lowest, even as it revealed their distance. Nobles could mask its bitterness with spice and sugar, while peasants swallowed it raw. Yet both knew the same truth. Wormwood never gave without taking, and every sip carried its shadow. When the plague rolled across Europe in the 14th century, the streets reeked of fear as much as death. Wormwood, already bitter in taste and reputation, was pressed into new roles as both shield and prayer. Apothecaries bundled its stalks into plague bags. The herb's sharp perfume, meant to cut through foul air and drive out the sickness, believed to travel on miasmas. Physicians in their long-beaked masks stuffed wormwood into the hollow noses, hoping its acrid scent would protect them. As they stepped into rooms where silence meant bodies, families clutched at the herb with desperation. Leaves were hung in windows, burned in hearths, or scattered across thresholds to bar the invisible enemy. In villages, healers brewed wormwood into choking teas for the fevered, forcing the bitter liquid past cracked lips in hopes of saving a life. The plant became a companion of suffering, its bitterness standing in for certainty when no true cure existed. Monasteries filled with chanting echoed the same ritual. Wormwood was steeped into dark waters and poured into the cups of the sick. Some monks claimed its sharpness cleansed the body of corruption. Others muttered that it was only a test of faith. Those who survived their dose credited the herb. Those who died were said to have been claimed before it could work. Either way, wormwood was present at the bedside, a bitter witness to the randomness of death. In the shadow of the plague, its symbolism deepened. The word itself carried weight. In Scripture, the Book of Revelation had named wormwood as the star that fell from heaven, poisoning rivers and making them bitter. To believers who watched neighbours collapse in the streets, the prophecy felt close at hand. Wormwood was no longer only a plant. It was a warning, a sign that God's judgment walked among them. Yet even as faith wrapped itself around the herb, doubt persisted. Some physicians noted that patients who drank wormwood often weakened faster, their bodies racked by tremors. Too much of the brew could hasten death rather than delay it, though families clung to it anyway. In a world where options were few, the line between cure and poison blurred until no one could see it clearly. By the time the plague waves subsided, wormwood had become more than medicine. It was an emblem of survival in desperate times, a plant that stood at the threshold of homes, churches, and deathbeds. Its bitterness had been carved deep into memory, forever linked with the stench of decay and the smoke of funeral pyres. For centuries afterward, the smell of wormwood still carried with it the echo of plague years. Sharp, acrid, and impossible to forget. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was awash in small bottles and curious concoctions. Apothecaries, those half-scientist, half-salesman figures of the early modern world, discovered a new way to market wormwood. Instead of cloaked in plague smoke or stuffed into masks, the bitter herb now arrived behind polished counters, carefully measured into tonics and bitters that promised relief from every ailment of the body. In towns from Venice to London, the shelves of apothecary shops gleamed with glass flasks filled with dark liquids. Labels praised wormwood as a cure for sluggish stomachs, sour humours, and the fatigue of age. Recipes were scribbled into thick ledgers, each variation blending wormwood with fennel, anise, or gentian root. The bitterness was still there, biting and sharp, but softened just enough to be palatable. A spoonful before meals was said to sharpen the appetite, to cleanse the body of invisible rot, to restore balance where imbalance threatened ruin. Bitters became part of daily life for the wealthy and ambitious. Court physicians prescribed them to noble households. Their recipes whispered like secrets between families, eager to prove their refinement. To serve wormwood bitters after a meal was a statement, a ritual that transformed harsh medicine into fashionable performance. A lady in Florence might press a vial into her guest's hand with a smile, as if to say that her household alone possessed the cure to weakness. But for the commoner, bitters were less performance than necessity. In taverns, crude versions were brewed in batches, sold to weary workers with the promise of strength. The bitterness was no less severe, but it was cheap and strong, offering a fleeting surge of warmth before weariness set in again. For men who laboured 12 hours in fields or workshops, the drink was a kind of armour, thin though it was. The reputation of wormwood grew more tangled with each decade. Physicians praised it as indispensable, yet warnings remained. Take too much, and the body shook with tremors. Take it daily, and dreams grew strange, haunted by visions that seemed to seep from the herb itself. But in a world where medicine was often trial and error, these risks were overlooked. Wormwood's bitterness had become familiar, its dangers accepted in the hope of healing. The age of bitters revealed something new about European society. Medicine was no longer just about survival. It was about ritual, fashion, and identity. Wormwood, dressed in glass bottles and wrapped in promises, was no longer the crude herb of peasant pots or the smoky memory of plague years. It was refined, almost elegant, its bitterness transformed into a daily habit that people believed they could not live without. Yet beneath the sweetness of fennel and the bite of anise, the old truth lingered. Wormwood still held the power to heal and the power to harm. And as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, that truth would prepare the ground for something far stronger than bitters, something that would take Europe by storm. Wormwood travelled wherever men carried packs and sails. For sailors crossing rough seas in the 17th and 18th centuries, the herb was packed in small bundles or distilled into sharp tonics. Its bitterness was believed to calm the stomach against waves and to drive away the fevers that came with foul water and foreign ports. The decks of ships often reeked of tar, sweat and salt, but beneath it lingered the acrid bite of wormwood, steeped into ale. To drink it was to anchor the body against nausea, though many found themselves unmoored in other ways. Soldiers, too, knew its sting. In campaigns across Europe, wormwood was issued in crude infusions, part medicine and part ritual. The French carried it into North Africa during colonial expeditions, blending it with rough spirits to mask the taste of stagnant water. English troops steeped it in cheap gin, convinced it offered protection against plague and fever. The herb became a battlefield companion, its bitterness swallowed as a form of defence, even as it wore down bodies already strained by war. For men accustomed to hardship, wormwood offered more than physical relief. It dulled hunger, blurred pain, and steadied hands in moments of fear. Around campfires, mugs were passed from soldier to soldier, the herb binding them in shared endurance. The bitterness was proof of loyalty, as if swallowing it meant shouldering more than one's share of suffering. In those moments, wormwood became less an herb and more a ritual of belonging, a way of proving that no one would falter while others endured the same taste. Yet addiction crept quietly into these habits. Men returned from campaigns, carrying not only scars, but a thirst they could not shake. What had begun as a dose against sickness became a nightly ritual, a cup that promised rest in the midst of restless memories. Sailors back from voyages sought wormwood tonics in taverns, swearing they could not sleep without it. Veterans carried flasks that trembled in their hands, their bodies weakened, but still demanding the sharp sting of the herb. In ports and barracks alike, wormwood left its mark. It was there in the fever tents, where medics forced it past cracked lips. It was there in the cramped hammocks of ships, where men clutched mugs to their chests like talismans. And it was there in the memories of those who survived, the bitterness etched so deeply into their tongues that even bread and beer could not erase it. By the dawn of the 18th century, Wormwood had travelled farther than any single herb had right to go. It had crossed deserts, oceans, and battlefields, leaving behind men who carried its taste as both comfort and curse. Its shadow stretched across continents, waiting for the moment when its bitterness would be transformed once more. By the 18th century, Wormwood had already lived many lives. It had been burned in plague fires, steeped in monkish brews, slipped into the pots of peasants, and carried on the seas in sailors' flasks. But in the mountain valleys of Switzerland, the bitter herb was about to be reborn. What had once been crude medicine and soldiers' tonic would transform into something dazzling, something dangerous, something immortal. In the alpine town of Cuvée, local healers began to distill wormwood with anise, fennel, and a bouquet of herbs. The process refined its bitterness, wrapping it in sweetness and perfume. The cloudy, pale green liquid that dripped from their stills did not taste like punishment. It tasted like ritual. It was said to clear the stomach, sharpen the mind, and ease the weariness of long winters. Bottled first as medicine, it was sold in apothecary shops with promises of vitality and cure. French soldiers stationed nearby were among the first to carry it beyond Swiss valleys. They poured it into canteens as disinfectant and tonic, a habit that followed them home after campaigns. In France, the drink spread quickly through the ranks, from soldiers to veterans, from veterans to cafés. The bitter taste of wormwood, once endured with clenched jaws, had been transformed into a spectacle. A glass, a slotted spoon, a sugar cube, a slow drip of water. What had once been a crude swallow in a dark room was now a performance gleaming under cafe lamps. The transformation was more than flavour. Wormwood's reputation shifted from cure and curse into art and allure. No longer just a peasant's brew or a monk's penance, it became an icon of Parisian life, the centerpiece of l'heure verte, the green hour. Painters, poets and dreamers lifted their glasses, swearing that inspiration swam within the milky haze. The bitterness of centuries had finally been dressed in glamour, yet the old shadows lingered. The herb that had once made men stumble and see flickers at the edge of their vision still carried its bite. Beneath the perfume of anise, the ancient bitterness waited, unchanged. And as glasses multiplied across boulevards and backrooms, so too did whispers of addiction, of tremors, of madness. The Green Fairy, as she came to be called, carried within her wings the long memory of wormwood, both healer and destroyer. The world had given bitterness a new face, but the taste was the same. From village pots to noble goblets, from plague smoke to soldier's flask, wormwood had always demanded a price. Now, as the 18th century turned, that price would be paid on a grander stage. The Green Fairy had arrived. Step back now from cloisters, plague houses, taverns, and battlefields. What remains is not just the story of a plant, but of how bitterness itself became part of Europe's survival. Wormwood was never simply a herb. It was a ritual, a test, a companion that demanded respect. To sip it was to accept suffering as a condition of healing. To brew it was to carry both faith and fear into the cup. Through the centuries, wormwood lingered in every corner of life. It was burned by priests as incense, prescribed by physicians as cure, whispered over by midwives as charm. It dulled hunger, steadied seasick stomachs, and carried soldiers through exhaustion. It was sacred to some, feared by others, but never ignored. Its bitterness became a language understood across class, country, and century, binding peasants and princes, monks and sailors, in the same grimace, after the same swallow. Yet bitterness is never forgotten. It leaves its mark deeper than sweetness ever could. The taste of wormwood haunted those who relied on it, a reminder that every cure carried its shadow. In time, that shadow would change shape. It would glitter in crystal glasses, bloom with sugar and water, and glow green beneath cafe lamps. The old herb would be dressed in ritual and glamour, but its essence remained the same. When Europe finally named it the Green Fairy, it was not creating something new. It was summoning a memory already centuries old. The bitterness of wormwood had prepared the way. The world was ready to drink, not only for healing, but for inspiration, escape, and ruin. And so the story of Wormwood does not end here. It bends forward, into the smoky cafes of Paris, into trembling hands and shattered glasses, into artists who swore they saw visions, and workers who drank to survive. The bitterness had always been waiting, and when it returned in the form of absinthe, it would capture not only bodies, but imaginations. History rarely remembers the herbs of the field, but wormwood endures, a thread running from ancient apothecaries to modern bottles, forever carrying the question it first posed centuries ago. Was it cure, or was it curse?